It was May 1999 in Snowtown, Australia, almost a 2-hour drive from Adelaide. David Johnson was out with his stepbrother, Jamie Vlasicus, who was helping him buy a computer. They were supposed to be going to Clare, however, they took a detour and headed to Snowtown. They both exit the car and walk towards an abandoned bank. Johnson, trusting his brother, follows him into the building. Once he entered, an arm was placed around his neck. His airways were cut off. Johnson was handcuffed. What came next was something from a nightmare. John Justin Bunting is one of Australia's worst serial killers. Most people outside of Australia have probably heard of Ivan Milat and the backpacker murders. But have you heard of John Bunting? Or the bodies in the barrel murders? The bodies in the barrel murders, also known as the Snowtown murders, took place in South Australia, where 12 people were murdered between 1992 and 1999. 8 bodies were stored in barrels filled with hydrochloric acid and stored in an abandoned bank vault in Snowtown, which was rented out by John Bunting and Mark Hayden. Bunting was the ringleader of a degenerate subculture of murders, cannibalism, and torture. 4 men went on murdering people, believing that they were ridding the world of pedophiles. One of the killers, Robert Wagner, even once said, "Pedophiles were doing terrible things to children. The authorities didn't do anything about it. I took that action. Thank you." John Bunting was often described by people who knew him as friendly, kind, a great talker, great with advice and helping people, good at making friends and compassionate. All great qualities in a person, right? Wrong. Bunting was a master manipulator and a very controlling person. All the truly disturbing attributes of a psychopath. He would prey on those who had a less than average intelligence. He saw them as easy to control, and this made it easy for him to get exactly what he wanted. A forensic psychiatrist believed that Bunting's behaviour suggested that he lacked emotion and the ability to have empathy with his victims, and that he was a psychopath who had great satisfaction from controlling his victims. They were forced to call him God, Lord Sir, Master, and Chief Inspector, as he would torture them. John wanted power and dominance. He loved the shock value and clearly had a God complex. John Justin Bunting was born the 4th of September 1966 in Inala, Queensland, a town known for both its high crime and high unemployment rates. John was an only child, and he was born with no sense of smell. He would be glad about later in his life, as this would end up working in his favour. Not that it was the reason he grew up to be the monster he was. Unfortunately, an event that he had as a child may very well have been the start of something unhealthy, menacing, and depraved. Bunting's mother, Jan, was an emotionally unavailable and domineering woman. She would often become angry at John. By the young age of 8, John would become very distant from his parents after suffering a traumatic event. 8-year-old John was over at a friend's house playing when he was abused by his friend's older brother. John was hogtied, pushed face down onto the mattress. John's friend was terrified of his own brother, who had been abusing him for years. John began to cry and was then punched by his abuser in the mouth and told to stop crying. John and his friend were both sodomized. His friend's older brother then called his friend saying, "I've got these 2 conditioned and we're going to have a party." The brothers' friends arrived and each took a turn in beating the 2 boys and burning them with cigarettes. Later on, his friend's father arrived home, entered his oldest son's room and began yelling at the teens to let the boys go. He untied them and sent John to a doctor. When John arrived home, his mother saw the welts on his face and smacked him in the mouth for being late for his tea. Not wanting anyone to know about what he had suffered, John went into the bathroom and placed wads of toilet paper in his pants, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. John never told anyone about what happened and became withdrawn. John's innocence was gone, taken from him in the most cruel and humiliating way at such a young age. Was this the event that shaped John into a human monster and down a very dark path of perversion and evil? From a young age, John had an interest in chemistry and electronics. As a kid, he would begin to torture insects by coming up with his own concoction acid, which was made up of nitric acid, brake fluid and chlorine. John would then put funnel web spiders and redback spiders into the fluid, cover it with a lid and watch them convulse, all while laughing. When the spider was inanimate, he would repeat the process. The teenage Bunting had an interest in digging big holes. He even dug a tunnel with a friend that measured 1.5 metres or 5 feet high, 4 metres or 13 feet deep, and 5 metres, about 16 feet long. He reinforced it with bricks and timber. John wanted to build an underground bunker for who knows what, but his father made him fill it all back in. As a teen, Bunting had a passion for weaponry. He collected guns and even started building his own weapons. Bunting would remove gunpowder from bullets to make his own explosives. One day, while John was at the library, he borrowed a book on World War II. He then went down a rabbit hole of German history, Nazism, and white supremacy. John began reading more racist literature and even managed to get his hands on a copy of Mein Kampf. He painted a swastika on his car, which horrified his parents, and his mother painted over it. These materials only fed John's hatred towards pedophiles more, and it began to fester. John hated gays and pedophiles because of what happened to him as a child. He saw homosexuals and pedophiles as the same. This was a common misguided trope, and it goes without saying that being gay and being a pedophile are in absolutely no way related. However, John didn't see it that way. He thought they were all the same and wanted them to be punished. When John was 13, he met a man named Benny. Benny was in his 40s and had also experienced horror similar to John, although in Benny's case, it was from his father. Benny would be tortured by his father and had his toes cut off with bolt cutters. John confided in Benny and asked him for protection, which was provided, but it came at a price. John was to pose as bait. The teenage John agreed and would stand on street corners. Being shot for his age and also looking younger than he was, this trap worked. As John was approached by their victims, they would ask John if he wanted to join them. John would then say something along the lines of, "Yeah, but I need to let my brother know where I'm going." John would then lead the victims down a dark alley where Benny was waiting. John and Benny would then wallop their victim within an inch of their lives and rob them, all while laughing. Over the years, John and Benny became very close, and Benny was like a father figure to him. They continued their violent acts together, breaking into homes of known pedophiles, wreaking havoc, and destroying everything. John and Benny were never charged for these crimes, and this made John feel invincible to the law, and he became cocky. A few months later, Benny was diagnosed with cancer and died. In 1986, Bunting started working in a slaughterhouse in South Australia. John was a butcher and mostly worked in the meat evisceration area, where he would cut out and remove the organs. Now, I find this repulsive, and I know a lot of you out there do too. However, John thoroughly enjoyed this job. Something he enjoyed a little too much, and often bragged about how slaughtering the animals was his favourite part about working there. He had other hobbies too, such as collecting weapons, making homemade poisons, blow torches, and Molotov cocktails. Bunting would hide his collection in a small space above the kitchen ceiling, where he had rope, knives, as well as his homemade poisons and blowtorch. Bunting would often brag about his activities to his friends in very graphic detail, leaving out nothing for the imagination. John loved to shock and disgust people. One of his favourite stories to tell involved an ex-girlfriend who had confided to John that she had been sexually abused as a child. John was disgusted by this act, so with the help of a friend, they drove along a highway between Adelaide and Melbourne with the offender. One of them drove, while the other cut up and strangled the pervert, throwing pieces of him out the window, all while they both laughed and sang as the pedophile's blood ran, soaking into the upholstery. In 1989, John met 18-year-old Veronica Tripp at a welding course. Veronica was below average intelligence, the way that John liked it. This was easy for him to control her. They would often go to the cinema, and John would always pick horror movies. Veronica didn't like them the way John did, but she was never allowed to pick the films. This is just more proof of how controlling John was. Veronica moved in with John and his housemates, and they were married in December of that same year. While at the welding course, John also met a man named Mark Hayden. Mark was born as Mark Lawrence on the 4th of December in 1958. Mark lived with his dad and older brother. His mother suffered from schizophrenia and was living in different mental health facilities. When Mark was 26 years old, sadly, his older brother was killed in an accident. And after being fired from his dad's business for stealing, Mark had a hard time holding down a job, and at some stage ended up changing his surname to Hayden. Hayden would later become friends with Bunting and a man named Robert Wagner, and would later play a part in the horrors that were to come. In 1991, Bunting and Veronica moved to Waterloo Corner Road, Salisbury North. Not far from them lived Barry Lane and Robert Wagner, an openly gay couple. Born on the 28th of November 1971 in Parramatta, New South Wales, Wagner was abandoned by his father when he was only 6 months old. When he was 3, his mother moved Robert and his sister to Adelaide in South Australia. At just age 7, Robert attempted suicide by taking an overdose of his mother's sleeping pills. It was later revealed that when Robert was young, he had been sexually abused by a teenage family friend. After this, Robert became distant, his behaviour changed, and he stopped turning up for school, eventually dropping out for good. At 13 years old, Robert would go missing for a few days at a time. His worried mum would report him missing, but he always would come back home. Eventually, Robert would introduce his mother to the person he'd been spending his time with, and to his mother's horror, it was 30-year-old Barry Lane. Barry had a record for sexual assault against underage boys and was a known pedophile. Robert's mother begged him to stop spending time with Barry, who would also sometimes go by the name Vanessa, and he would dress in women's clothing. Robert refused. The next year, when Robert was 14 and Barry was 31, they ran away together and were not seen for 4 years. When Robert turned 18, Barry and Robert returned to Adelaide and lived together in Barry's home, which was just a short walking distance from the future home of John Bunting and his wife Veronica. Robert Wagner met John and they became friends, both sharing similar interests such as Nazism and white supremacy. They both idealised Adolf Hitler. Bunting decided to take Wagner under his wing, even though Bunting had an extreme hatred towards pedophiles and homosexuals. He didn't believe that Wagner was gay, but that Barry had actually brainwashed him. With Bunting's charisma and convincing ways, he was able to gain Wagner's support completely. Bunting was determined to save Wagner and encouraged him to help him get rid of the pedophile filth. And when Bunting asked Wagner to assist him in the murders, he was happy to comply. Wagner and Barry would later go on to help Bunting dispose of his first victim, while Wagner would continue to help him in the remaining murders. John used Barry to gain contact with other pedophiles so that he could get his vigilante justice. Through spending more time with John, Robert's hatred towards homosexuals and pedophiles began to grow, and he started to distance himself from Barry. Bunting's murder spree would begin in August of 1992. 22-year-old Clinton Trezise was an openly gay man who lived on his own in a flat. Clinton had a rough childhood after his parents divorced when he was 3 years old, and he was put into foster care. Clinton was friends with both Robert and Barry, and it was through the couple that he was introduced to John. Clinton was invited into Bunting's home for a visit one day, where they talked for a while, and Bunting accused Chazais of being a pedophile and calling him Happy Pants. Chazais was gay, but he was in no means a pedophile. But to John, that made no difference, and Chazais was bashed to death with a shovel to the head and face in Bunting's living room. Robert panicked initially, but was calmed down by Barry, and they both helped to dispose of Clinton's body. The carpet in the living room where Clinton lay was cut around him, and he was rolled up in the carpet and buried in a shallow grave which went undiscovered for 2 years. Bunting would not kill again for 3 years.